So today we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerability disclosure policy. And before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about my background and why this matters to me. I'm currently the Senior Director of Research Operations at Bugcrowd. I have a 23,000 person crowd from around the world that find and report vulnerabilities in our customers' programs. But before this, I was on the other side at customers working in product security response, where I handled all of the WebKit and third-party library vulnerabilities at BlackBerry. So I've been on both sides of the vulnerability disclosure fence, and that gives me, I think, a fairly cool perspective to have on the struggles on both sides. Before that, I've done data analysis and criminal investigation work. I love coming in and seeing the APT presentations because I totally geek out on attribution. I worked on Zotob. And before that, and my core foundation, I am not a comp sci person. I'm a behavioral psychologist, and I am lawful good defender for life. So, and I'm a big nerd, which you'll see in my slides. So before we get started, this is not a debate about responsible versus coordinated disclosure, about the morals, about the ethics. We're not going to talk about the non-disclosure position. The purpose of today's talk is to talk about the communication of vulnerabilities from researchers to vendors with the goal of getting those vulnerabilities fixed. So you can call it whatever type of disclosure you would like to call it. The history of disclosure policy is long. We have 15 years of very smart, very well-intentioned people working on this problem. The first vulnerability disclosure policy that I've come across that is truly written as a policy is based on academic attribution policy, and it was written by a researcher named Rainforest Puppy, and it was RF policy. And since then, there's been OIS, which was primarily a group of vendors that wrote that after RF policy. EI wrote their own policy, NGS had their own policy, ZDI. Microsoft came out with coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Google Project Zero has their disclosure policy. And we have ISO standards that are now being written, or have been written, forgive me, on disclosure policy. We have lots of disclosure policies. And each of them has failed. Now, those are fighting words. And the reason I say they've all failed is because no one of those policies is being used in any meaningful way by large groups of organizations. You can't go to multiple vendor websites and see they're saying, I'm following disclosure policy X. You will occasionally see researchers say, well, Project Zero does this sort of timeline, I was following that. But they're following that without being a member of Project Zero, without being in the vendor who's agreeing to that. So there's no mutual agreement on any of these policies. So how do we get to a better place? And how did we get here to begin with? One of our first problems is we have an incredibly diverse ecosystem. We have researchers around the world with a variety of skill sets, from very entry level, and they have very little history in vulnerability community, vulnerability and security research culture. They went to school, got a comp sci degree. Security's hot, there's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of opportunity. And web app vulns, they saw a class, they got burp, they know how to do this, right? And so they're finding vulnerabilities and reporting them. But you also have incredibly skilled professionals, the likes of Charlie Miller. So you have this wide array of researchers. You have just as wide an array of vendors. So medical devices, cars, websites, a company the size of Microsoft down to a company the size of Zenefits, a little Bay Area startup that handles HR and benefits. So we have all these different backgrounds, all these different types. And so what you hear on both sides, whether it's researcher or customer, is this policy doesn't fit my business model. Doesn't take into account my specific business needs. This policy doesn't represent both sides fairly. Or, I don't trust the other party. And we hear that on both sides, not just vendors saying they don't trust researchers, but researchers don't trust vendors either. So we have not found the one policy to rule them all. We have at best some very well-intentioned policies that are like a one-size-fits-all t-shirt. And if we all got a unisex XXL t-shirt when we came to SaaS, not many of us would wear it because it doesn't fit us. So we have this infighting. This is another big problem we have. Those are the Hatfields and McCoys, and they had a legendary blood feud. Okay, why do we have problems between researchers and vendors when we're all defenders? We're all fighting against the bad guys. We're all trying to stamp out these vulnerabilities before they get used for exploitation, right? Well, you start with vendors build a product. They're delivering a product. And yes, they want to deliver a secure product, but what they really want is deliver great new features that capture market attention and sell product. Researchers break products. They distract you from your core deliverables. It's a total pain in the butt, right? No, they are providing objective third-party quality control. For low to no cost in many cases, they are seeing past your blind spots as a developer from the specs of what you know this should be doing to what you can do with it. And the other problem we have that has created infighting is that the data shows vendors fix faster if a researcher odays them. Sad, true though, and it happens for a lot of reasons. It doesn't just happen for the PR shame. And the reality is, on the surface, it looks like if I oday you, you'll fix it faster. But that's not really the case, because when a researcher odays a vendor, there are a whole bunch of other vulnerabilities that may have actually been more critical that didn't get fixed because everybody had to divert to the thing that's public now. And so researchers may have reported one or two vulnerabilities to a vendor, but they don't have a view into all the other vulnerabilities in that priority stack. And so that lack of transparency doesn't help the researcher understand, why isn't my P1 vulnerability the first thing you fix? Because they don't realize the vendor has 8 other P1 vulnerabilities. So we have this infighting, which has created this culture of misunderstanding and distrust. So back in 2003, when I started in computer security, this was the position: trust no one. Vendors don't talk to researchers, researchers don't talk to vendors. If you're a researcher and you find a vulnerability, you drop it on full disclosure, because you can't trust the vendor. They're not going to fix it. They may even threaten you legally. Just don't do it. Just like Mulder and Scully, sometimes you really need the help of somebody else. Somebody who has that outside perspective, who has information that can help you. But you don't really trust them. Like, you're collaborating on a short-term basis, and you're always having to verify if you continue that trust. That trust can be revoked, because trust takes time and it's not absolute. Trust is formed between individuals. This is something that came up multiple times yesterday as we were talking, both John Lambert and then another speaker later were talking about the fact that we build trust at these events and we start working together as defenders. And we get together and we network and we meet at conferences, and that takes time. That takes time to develop, and it's not just a blind faith. And it's not between organizations, it's between us as individuals. And that's a human cue of in-person conversation. From the time you're a baby, you start deciding who you can trust and who's being good to you and who's being mean to you based on facial and verbal cues that you don't get through email. So there's a lot of history behind how we build trust that comes into play here. So the next question is, well, what's wrong with the status quo? I mean, we've had this disclosure conversation a billion times. We've got all those policies you've talked about. And what's do we really need to rehash this again? Clearly the problem is trust. The policies are probably just fine. We'll eventually grow into them. And the problem with the status quo is that this is the status quo. The status quo is Charlie and Chris seeing that previous car vendors didn't take research and go fix it quickly, and that other researchers didn't get their work acted on, and feeling like they needed to go public to actually get this fixed. But they also told Chrysler all along what they were doing. They were reporting their vulnerabilities to Chrysler, and Chrysler never gave them any input about We're working on it. We need a couple more weeks. We found a regression when we were testing. Nothing. It was a black box. So Charlie and Chris had no reason to believe that it wouldn't take them 5 years to fix it because they just kept putting it off. So while I am horrified that they live tested on a highway, I understand why it all happened, and it makes me sad. No one's happy with this, and that's why we have to fix this. There is a lack of ecosystem buy-in. Those car vendors aren't bought into disclosure policy. You can't mandate trust with a policy. You can't require researchers to trust the vendors. You can't require the vendors to trust the researchers and communicate. There is no escalation path. If in your job there's an HR policy violation, you go to HR and they fire up an investigation. Presumably the right thing is done, one would hope. If there's an academic policy violation, you go to the Dean of Students. Who do you go to for a vulnerability disclosure violation? CERT? If you're a researcher, that could work. But how many researchers outside the US even know about that? Or would think that they could contact it? How well is that publicized? Can CERT handle that load? Possibly. But is that the right role for them? Right now, it's really unclear who you escalate to. Other than public shaming, we end up with dog shaming pictures of vendors out on the internet. We have overgeneralized solutions, which I think I've mentioned a couple times. Everyone has an edge case that doesn't fit the scenario, and so it's just not working. It's not working for vendors, and it's not working for researchers. And every time a situation like Charlie, the one that happened with Charlie Miller happened, a lot of it's on the vendors, but a lot of it's on the researchers. It is a complex ecosystem, and we are all interconnected. So right now, we have a 2-drink minimum for building relationships, it seems like. This is last year at SAS. And we can all get along, but this doesn't scale. If you get a vulnerability report from a researcher in the Philippines, it could be a great vulnerability report, and you are not going to fly to the Philippines to build a relationship with that person. So we have to start thinking about, how do we redefine our trust models? How do we start building trust without the in-person meeting? How do we determine where we can take risks on information sharing to give someone the opportunity to prove that they're trustworthy? What's an acceptable level of risk to expose to say, hey, I want to share some information with you. This needs to stay between us. This is what we're working on. And if they maintain that trust, then next time maybe you can tell them a little more. And if they don't, now you know next time you're not going to. But you have to understand what's the acceptable risk to take there and start thinking about it versus just trust no one. So I keep saying, this is not working. Vulnerability disclosure is only marginally ahead of where it was 10 to 15 years ago. We have policies that people aren't consistently following. We still have researchers publishing vulnerabilities. Every time you have a Tavis Ormandy tweet that he doesn't know how to, he has an AVG vulnerability and he can't figure out who to report it to, and a ton of people will say, they have a bug bounty program, or here, I know someone at AVG, and a few days later he ODAs them. That hurts all the researchers. Because now vendors who aren't in this room and don't have the maturity to differentiate that Tavis is not the face of all researchers just because he's in the news, they just think researchers are bad and they're out to shame them and make them look bad and not work with them. Because we paint in these big stereotypes until you get to know researchers and start breaking them down and realize, hey, I can be friends with 8 different researchers and they're all totally different. Different motivations, different behavioral styles, and that's okay. At the same time, every time you have a Chrysler situation where the vendor doesn't do the right thing, or Seagate, there's a researcher in Australia who spent months trying to get a vulnerability reported to Seagate. Seagate gave him the runaround, wasn't going to fix it. When he finally went public, they made it sound like it was no big deal. They had some back and forth in the press, basically debating the technical merits. That makes researchers look at all vendors as, you're just giving me the runaround. You don't want to fix it. You don't take this seriously. So we need to start demonstrating trustworthy behaviors. We need to break down these barriers and work as a coordinated team because we are all defenders. The researchers are finding vulnerabilities in our software, which is inherently offensive, but the fact that they try to report it to you turns it into a defensive activity because they want it fixed. So, I have more time than I expected to have left, so I'm going to take some time to really dig into the call to action because this is important. You need to stop being a tourist. This stuff affects you, and you are here, which means you understand why this is important. You're more than likely with an organization that gets it, that has a security response model, that invests in this stuff. Home Depot, their view was, we sell hammers. They don't see themselves as a target, they're a retailer. Little small startups with 30 people, big, huge companies that don't view themselves as a software company, IoT, automotive industry, all of these companies could use our help. So what are we going to do about it? Join an industry working group. If you're an optimist, come help us make the problem better. If you're a pessimist, make sure we don't screw it up. There are a number of things you can do to get involved. The Department of Commerce has brought together a multi-stakeholder group of people to talk about vulnerability disclosure. At the time, there were a ton of tweets about, really, we're still talking about this? Yes we are, because it's not working. So there's a number of groups within this NTIA organization looking at, is the problem adoption and awareness of the existing policies? Is the problem that there's not enough clarity around multi-vendor reporting when you find a vulnerability that affects multiple vendors, whether it's open source code or just shared code? How do we handle that? And can we clarify there and make that easier? There are working groups around the economic incentives to disclosure, as well as safety, IoT, automotive, and disclosure there, and how that may be a little unique and different from disclosure of a web app vulnerability. So you can get involved, and you don't have to be a chairperson of a group. You don't have to come to every single meeting. But if you're reading the mailing lists and you're giving feedback on policies, you can help make sure that it's really well-rounded and that it has good input. We honestly could use more researchers in the group. So if you identify yourself as a security researcher and you want to make sure that the security researcher position is really well represented, I would really encourage you to get involved. Publish your documentation, publish case studies, publish your workflows. Explain, here's how we handle incident response, here's how we handle disclosure. Maybe we don't actually need one disclosure policy to rule them all. Maybe we just need every company publishing their disclosure policy so that the researcher and the vendor have a set of ground rules that they're both working off of, that they can both hold each other accountable to, that they can set their expectations on. This also gives you an opportunity to get feedback on your processes and documentation, make them better. But the other great thing is that the companies who don't know where to start, they can look to you for guidance and leadership. And you know, by publishing some of that, you can really help out across the industry. Take the time to mentor security folks in less mature vendors, or even developers that you know in vendors that could use some work on their security maturity in terms of incident response. There's a lot of them. Talk to researchers, there's a lot of them too. You'll find that there's a wide, diverse array of motivations and personas, what motivates people to disclose to a vendor. Some of them, honestly, they don't actually care about getting the software fixed. They want their name in advisory so they can get a better job. And that's a completely legitimate reason to report vulnerabilities. Maybe they want a bug bounty because that's how they provide income for their family. Okay, that's legitimate too. But different motivations are all there, and very, very few of them come down to, I don't like that vendor and I want to make their life difficult. There's usually a pretty altruistic reason or legitimate reason behind their work. So I think the last thing that I would say that is most important is demonstrate trustworthiness. Remember that you're representing really the industry in a lot of ways. So the researchers all talk to each other just like the vendors all talk to each other. And we have to bridge that gap between the two parties, and we're not going to ever do that if we don't start showing that we can be trusted as much as we want them to trust us. So my parting thought is actually from a slide by David Leno of Adobe, and he used this very recently, just a couple weeks ago at AppSec California, because it's not just me saying we need to build trust. We need to build trust. And he was specifically talking about researchers. No one in the security community is evil, the ones, at least not the ones who communicate with you. And it is an oversimplification, absolutely. But it challenges our stereotypes. And it makes us think about the fact that not every company has had their security renaissance. Like, it's really hot and really important for all of us, and we know how important it is, but not every company gets it yet. And so we can help them. Or maybe they just had their security renaissance in the last year or two, and they don't have the 10 plus years of the TWC memo at Microsoft to build up that muscle memory of here's how we do it. And when a researcher goes public, we don't all panic and set the world on fire. We say, well, yeah, but that's a CVSS 4.7. Knock yourself out. We have the appropriate measured response because we know what we're doing. We can help those other vendors learn that experience and learn that muscle memory. We need to help them speed up. So that's my last slide. These are, as I mentioned, the NTIA multi-stakeholder working groups that are working on vulnerability disclosure. Please feel free to come talk to me. I am co-chair of the multi-party disclosure working group with Katie Masuris and Art Mannion from CERT. Katie is one of the co-chairs of adoption and awareness, but she and I are both happy to talk to you about any of the 4 groups and help you get involved or just answer any questions. So that's it. Thank you very much.